And I will be um, meeting with you guys every Friday from 4 to 5 for the next few weeks, except for next week's, which will be on a Thursday. So I'm a New Jersey AmeriCorps watershed ambassador. And so what that means is that I took a term of service for about a year, and it's a partnership between AmeriCorps, which is kind of like the Peace Corps almost, and it's with the NJDEP as well. And we go out and we monitor streams and rivers and basically try to educate the public about our water resources. So the Walk Hill River area is mainly in Sussex County. So we do things like what we're doing right now, education. I also go out and I spend a lot of time with middle schoolers and high schoolers, talking to them about various things about the environment. And we also do lots of cleanups. So that's like beach sweeps. We clean up parks, rivers, streams. And we do other stewardship activities like workshops aside from this, like hands-on projects like rain barrels and rain gardens. And of course, one of our favorite parts of our service is to go out and do stream assessments, where we literally take nets and we go out and we survey the streams in our area for macroinvertebrates, which are like the tiny bugs basically that live in the stream, and that can give us an idea of how healthy a stream is. Watershed, that term, you'll hear that quite often as it relates to a lot of these talks. It's just the landscape and how its curvature allows for water to accumulate in a single body of water. So for us, that's the Walk Hill River. And so it includes not only the landscape, but it includes things like plants and animals, our infrastructure, our impervious surfaces like parking lots, roads, and everything we do in it, right? So a watershed really is just an accumulation, taking into consideration that landscape and everything that is on it and how it functions and how that water drains into a common source. And so this is a picture of our watershed. So we're up here in Sussex County. If you're from another county, you might be from, or even the somewhere else in Sussex County, you might be in a different watershed. So we're up here. There's 20 different watersheds in New Jersey. The one right next to us, if you're in a different part of Sussex County, is the Upper Delaware watershed. In our watershed, it flows northward up into New York State, and it empties into the Hudson River at about Kingston, New York. So we're basically the headwaters in the beginning of this watershed, and the headwaters actually start at Lake Mohawk in Sparta, which is an artificial lake that was created, and now it's just like this nice lake community that serves as the headwaters for our watershed. And so with that being said, we're going to talk every week about something different that pertains to water resources, and how we can better manage either our own practices or the land around us that depends on that watershed. So this week we'll be talking about invasive species in New Jersey, ones that you might likely find in your own backyard. So we'll go into what is an invasive species. We'll also talk about the factors that allow these species to come into a new area and establish themselves. We'll also talk about environmental and ecological consequences. So what happens to the environment and to other species in that ecosystem when those invasive species come in. And then we'll talk more in depth about ones that you're going to find probably in your backyard or somewhere common in New Jersey, where they came from, and ways that you can try to get rid of them. So starting first with invasive species, what are they? So NOAA, which is a government agency, they define invasive species as an organism that causes ecological or economic harm in a new environment where it is not native. And all that really means is that an invasive species will come into a new area, and it usually will cause some sort of disruption. Maybe it interrupts the food chain, maybe it causes harm to some sort of industry, or it costs money to manage that that invasive species and to try to get rid of it. So I put these pictures here just so that you know invasive species come in all different kinds of forms. They can be aquatic in freshwater systems, they can be plants, insects, they can be marine in nature. So basically these organisms can come from all different places and they can come into newer environments where they were not previously seen before. And so the way they usually are transported is by us, actually. So we have a lot of international trade that happens throughout all of the different countries in the world, right? So ballast ships come in and they can release their water. So as they're traveling, they pick up water and then they can release that water in ports. So we've seen in New Jersey actually quite an increase in aquatic invasive species because New Jersey has a major port in it. And of course, international travel by us mainly, right? So we might go to different places and especially if you go out and you travel internationally and you go on hikes and things like that, and you may never even think to clean your shoes, for example, when you travel in between countries. You could be carrying seeds of a plant from somewhere across the world back home, right? And so sometimes these things are totally unintentional, like we didn't plan it, but a lot of it has actually been intentional, especially when it comes to the ornamental plant trade, right? A lot of different plants were brought in from around the world because they are beautiful and we wanted to plant them in urban areas or in our gardens for aesthetic landscaping. So unfortunately, we have this problem now because we travel a lot, we trade a lot, and we were kind of unaware of the consequences of these things when we first started the ornamental plant trade. And so now we're going to talk about the factors that allow for these species to take establishment in a new area. So if you have any questions about any of this, try to write it down and save it for the end of the talk. So the first kind of category of things is performance related traits, meaning things that are related to physiology, biomass, growth rate, size, and fitness. And so what these things mean, physiology, right? This could be for a plant, it could be maybe this plant has bigger leaves than a native plant, and therefore it can maybe outshadow, it might put shade over another native plant, or it might absorb more sunlight and outcompete another species. Biomass means basically how big is that plant? How much leaf matter and how much root matter does it have? So what we find a lot of the times is that many invasive species are actually quite large, and maybe they don't appear quite large above ground, but they do tend to have really massive root systems when it comes to plants. Growth rate, these plants or organisms tend to grow very rapidly. And so that allows them to kind of reproduce and then sprout up, reproduce and sprout up. And that allows them to kind of take over an area. And again, with size, they might actually be even taller than native species. And what that can do in terms of plants is create shade, or it might get more of a resource that would have been available to a native species, but now it isn't. And overall fitness deals with reproductive traits. So because that organism has taken hold in that environment, now it's doing really good, it's thriving, and so it can reproduce or spread quite easily. So these performance related traits really help those organisms go into a system and kind of allocate its own characteristics so that it can be better fit for that area than maybe even a native species. Another factor that relates to this is called phenotypic plasticity. I know this is like a word a lot of people might not be familiar with. So phenotypic plasticity is the ability of an organism to express different traits in different environments. So if we look at this image up here, we'll see there's like a green leaf, kind of like a purpley red leaf, and then one that has like purpley spots on it, right? And so this just means that in different environments, that plant, given different amounts of sunlight, was able to change the color of its leaf, right? Another example of this is that maybe an organism goes into a new environment and it is able to withstand different temperatures than a native species. So maybe if there's like a weird temperature change in the system, that non-native species might say, oh, this is pretty cool. I like this environment. So basically, these organisms are able to kind of change what needs to be changed in order to better suit that environment. So maybe for this plant, oh, if it's in like a really dark environment, maybe it changes the color of its leaf so that it can conserve its resources better than maybe a native species. Or maybe in a lot of sunlight, a leaf expresses a different kind of color or characteristic so that it is better able to use those resources. And what you come to find with a lot of these species is that it's all about resources. And they tend to hog the resources. They're very good at taking resources, hogging them up, and depriving them from surrounding species, and those are usually our native species. And so these invasive species, they tend to have higher phenotypic plasticity when compared to the native species. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because a native species, you think, oh, in this area, it's accustomed to this. It's having a good time in that environment. It doesn't really need to change much because it was built kind of to be that way. Whereas these invasive species, you want to think of them kind of as generalists. They can kind of go anywhere and they'll change themselves so that they can better survive in that environment. Another one is lack of biological control. So sometimes an invasive species will come into a system and it won't have any natural predators, right? And so there's these terms called top, bottom, and bottom top control. So predators might put pressure on lower organisms, so things that they would eat. And in that way, they'll control the system. But what if an organism comes into the system and there is no top predator to that? So maybe something comes into this system, it's maybe a ginormous fish or something like that, that then can outcompete this species, and therefore that affects the rest of the food web. Or it can also have a different effect where maybe it's actually at the bottom of the food web and it is consuming so many lower trophic level organisms that it then cannot support higher level organisms, messes up the whole thing. Another part of this is disease. So maybe in a native habitat, a species experiences some sort of regular disease to maintain that and to regulate that population. So maybe a disease comes in the springtime every year and it kills like 10% of that plant. And that's a form of control so that it doesn't get out of hand every year. Another thing might be environmental conditions. Maybe in a native habitat, that invasive species has a very cold season, and then it is put into an environment, a new environment, where it doesn't have that cold season. So it just keeps on growing. It doesn't go dormant, for example. All of these things play a role in biological control. And so when you take something out of its native environment, put it into a new one, it might not have these built-in levels of biological control. Another aspect is range expansion by climate change. So what happens with this is that as the climate changes, we'll see that warmer weather is concentrated towards the equator. And so as the climate changes, what we see is that that warmer region is spreading polewards, meaning it's spreading northward and southward. And so the warmer regions are becoming more prevalent in higher and lower latitudes. And so where you might have had a species, maybe it was like in I don't know, Florida, right? But as the range got bigger, well, now it's really favorable in Georgia too. And maybe that wasn't an introduction by humans. It just was that the climate then changed in that area and it became favorable to another species. It allowed that species to spread into a region that it normally wouldn't have otherwise. So taking all of these factors into account, you can understand that it's a very complex thing, and these aren't even all of the factors that can contribute to invasive species, just a few of them. So when they come into a system, they can have environmental and ecological consequences, right? And one of the biggest ones is loss of habitat, because that invasive species is going to come into that area. And for the most part, because it's prolific, it's reproducing fast, it's spreading fast, it takes up a lot of space. And that's space that could have been used by a native species. So I'm going to pretty much use plants for an example for this. So if you can picture a field, right? And maybe it had like 10 different species, right? And they were all kind of doing their thing. But then one invasive species comes in and it dominates that whole area. This is kind of like if you were to work in an office and you have that like annoying coworker that comes in and they like invade your space and you're like, get away from me. That's exactly what happens to these native plants, is that this very overpowering presence of an invasive species will come in and crowd out those native species. If you're in an office, you might even quit your job, and that's what happens to these non-native, to the native plants, is they actually just have no place to go, so they end up becoming, their population drops due to that loss of habitat. And because of that loss of habitat, you lose you lose biodiversity, because where you would have had those 10 species, maybe now you only have 3 species because there just wasn't enough space for them. And so there's this really profound statistic from the Nature Conservancy. So invasive species have directly contributed to the decline of 42% of the threatened and endangered species in the US. And you can see how that is, because it's because of this loss of habitat. If you don't have a place to live, so that may not even just be threatened and endangered plant species, that could be the species that depend on that habitat. Birds, amphibians, right? They all depend on that habitat, and if they don't have a place to live, then they have a hard time reproducing. And that's how we get that loss of biodiversity. And this ties also into, as we were saying before, those altered food web dynamics. Maybe, you know, where you had that system of diverse plants and that was supporting different kinds of mammals and amphibians and stuff, now it's not. Maybe they've lost some source of food. And along with that can come things like altered soil chemistry and a change in water quality, because maybe those plants are taking up nutrients, or sometimes non-native plants can release chemicals into the soil that will alter the chemistry. And ultimately, the result of all of this is that we have a loss of ecosystem services. So the ecosystems of the planet, they provide services to us. So for example, you know, a forest provides so many different services to us, like filtering out carbon dioxide. It provides stability to the soil with the root systems of the trees. The plants will help filter out non-point source pollutants. But when we start to lose this natural diversity of plants and other organisms, we lose those services that happen to us. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of really prevalent ones here in North America. So Phragmites is, I'm sure you've seen this plant. You'll see it on the sides of roads. You'll see it on coastal areas. You'll see it wetland areas. They take over. It's like these very tall plants. Sometimes they're like, you know, 8 or more feet tall. And they come into a system and they just take up all the nutrients, and they reproduce so fast and so rapidly that they just take over an area, and they create what is called a monoculture. So this is like a field that is just basically all Phragmites, and it's kind of like, you can see like a tree here maybe. It's just taken over areas, and areas that are particularly prone to this kind of invasion are like open fields where there's no sort of competition for these species. Another one is the zebra mussel. So these, I believe, are from Asia. And these mussels, they're kind of pretty actually, the shells, but they're in freshwater streams and rivers throughout North America. And what happened when these were first introduced into the system, they're filter feeders, they're bivalves. So they will take in phytoplankton from the water column, and they will use that as a food source. Well, the problem was that these zebra mussels came into the system, and there were so many of them doing so much filter feeding that they got rid of they put a severe decline on the phytoplankton communities, which so many other organisms depend on to eat. And what ended up happening was that the fish population started to drop because of this, and therefore it affected a lot of fishing industries. So these are just some examples of how, you know, a species can come into a system, really take it over. And here you can see, like with the zebra mussels, it can have direct effect on people's livelihoods. So now we're going to talk, and I'm sure this is what everybody's here for, is the invasive species you might find in New Jersey, the ones that you might find in your own backyard, where they came from, and some ways that you might be able to get rid of them. The first one we're going to talk about is called mugwort. So this plant was likely introduced to North America in the 16th century, and it's native to Europe and Eastern Asia. And in those areas, it was historically used as an herbal medicine, but here we see it as more of just like an invasive species. And I'm not, as far as I know, I don't really know too many people who go out in their backyard and are like, mugwort, I'm going to make some herbal medicine. But maybe that's something you could do now if you see it. So you can really tell mugwort apart from other plants is that it has these really pointed leaf ends. And it tends to be a very bright green on the front. And then the underside, this is what distinguishes it from lots of other species, is that it has this woolly white underside. And it has these flowers. They're very tiny. And so you'll see this plant growing oftentimes towards like bridges by roads and stuff. You might even see it in your backyard. And they're perennial, so they come back every single year. A lot of the times you'll see them and they're very tall, like 3, 4, 5 feet tall. They've been noted to look like chrysanthemum and have a very distinct smell. I've never smelled these flowers or plants before, so I'm not positive, but I've read that they have a very distinct smell. And what is so intense about this species is that it has a rhizome system. And a rhizome system is basically like these roots that they move out horizontally underground, and they give rise to new plants. So even if you come in and you cut down that plant or you try to pull it up, if there's still rhizomes in the soil, then new plants can grow out of those rhizomes. So it is highly recommended that you don't pull these out, because it's very likely that you will leave rhizomes in the soil, and those leftover rhizomes will produce more plants. And while this species doesn't really produce seeds very often in North America, it does have this intense rhizome system that allows it to spread very quickly and very fast. So some of the management practices for this to try to keep it under control is, number one, to do a regular walk around on your property and to try to spot it. And if you can, the earlier you spot it, the better off you will be, because then you can try to maintain the plant population before it does develop this very intense rhizome system. One thing you can do if you do have mugwort in your yard is you can actually try to cut it down. You can, if you have a lot of it, you can try to mow it like Kermit is. Or you can go in with whatever tools you have, and maybe you have a small patch of it, and you can cut down those plants to about like a kind of like to an inch or a couple inches. And what that does is it stresses the plant out. So every time you whack down a plant, it has resources stored in its root. So every time you whack the plant down, it tries to take the resources out of the root and push it upwards. And what that does, especially if you've cut it down, is it kind of drains it of its resources. You kind of like try to starve it. But remember that these plants are very hardy. They come back very strong. So you want to be regular with your treatment. If you can get out there once a year, and if you have mugwort, and try to mow it down, or even if it comes back even faster than that, the more often you mow it, the better, because that you're going to start really draining the root system of its resources, which will stress that plant out and hopefully kill it. You can also do a non-selective herbicide. I'm going to say here that if you're ever going to use an herbicide, make sure you read the directions very carefully, and you might even want to consult with like a master gardener before you do any of this. So a non-selective herbicide, it can kill other plants around it, right? Because it's non-selective, and it's still going to require multiple applications. So basically, no matter what with mugwort, like if you're going to tackle the problem, like it's a commitment. Like you're gonna be married to the project for a very long time, at least 2 or 3 years. The next one is Japanese barberry, which is actually a very beautiful shrub. You might even have one in your own yard. So these are native to China and Japan, and they were introduced as an ornamental plant in about the 1860s. So they're shrubs, so they're kind of small. They can be a couple feet tall. Some are taller than others, and they're woody. So they have these kind of like woody branches, and they have these really beautiful like red berries. The flowers are also small and yellow, and you'll see those flowers appear April through June. But the berries, they last for a very long time. They last from about July to October. And much like the mugwort, they also have a rhizome structure and can reproduce that way. But Japanese barberry also is able to create colonies because a single plant contains both male and female reproductive organs. So basically, if you have one, they can just be like, I'm going to create a colony, and there's not much you can do about it. And so the leaves for this are going to come out in the spring, and they're going to last until the fall. And so if you see this in the woods, that's how you can start to identify species. If you go out every couple months, every season, and you take note of plants and how they're changing, you'll see this one big identifier will be these berries, which will be out from the summer to the fall. And so even though it's a very pretty plant, I guess what can you do about it, right? So you can try to actually yank these out of the ground or use like a shovel or some other tool to dig it out. And you want to do this before July, which is when those berries come out and when they can drop those berries and spread them, right? Another thing you can do is, because it's a woody plant, you can cut it to about a 1-inch stub, and then you can paint on an herbicide. And so anytime you're going to use an herbicide, you want to have as targeted of a method as you can, right? Because you don't want to kill, especially if you have a garden, you don't want to kill everything that's in your garden or in your backyard, right? You want to be very targeted. And another thing with herbicides or any sort of pesticide is that when it rains, those things go into the local water source. So you want to be very targeted and direct in your usage. You don't want to just like go out there and put it all over everything. So if you do go with a method like this, you can literally take a paintbrush and paint it onto the stump. One that was recommended is a Roundup poison ivy killer. You can paint that right on the stump, and hopefully that will start to kill the plant. Another thing you can do is kind of like rounds of cutting and herbicide treatment. So you can also, on the shrub, you can cut off a lot of different branches, and you can cut it down to maybe like 6 or 12 inches, like a foot. And what'll happen is it'll, again, take resources from its roots, reallocate up to the branches, and therefore it's kind of starving itself of resources and taking that big effort to create more plant. And then once it does that, you let it sprout again. You can cut it to that 1-inch stub and put the herbicide on it. So that's also a good method, especially if you don't have the time to go out and cut everything to a stump and paint. You can just, for a season, you can just clip them, allow the resources to come out to the branches, and then go in next season and cut to a 1-inch stub and apply the herbicide. You can also use a foliar herbicide. I'm going to say this is not the most direct herbicide, right? The other kinds you can paint on. A foliar herbicide you spray on the leaves. If you're going to use a foliar herbicide, make sure that it has some sort of dye in it, because you want to make sure that you're having a targeted response here, that you're not just spraying anything, that you're spraying directly on that plant. Another thing you can do if you want to go a non-herbicide route is you can just continuously keep cutting it down. So you can either mow it if you have like one of those more intense mowers, or you can just go in if you have some of them and just cut them to that 1-inch stub every season. You want to go like at least once a year. Other things you can do, not really recommended, as this really requires a lot of skill and technique, is a prescribed burning or flame weeding, which is where they come in and they heat treat the plants and in hopes that that will kill them. So another thing about Japanese barberry is that it plays a role in promoting ticks. So the barberry bush underneath it, it will create like a microclimate that is warmer and it's more humid than its surrounding environment, which ticks think is pretty awesome. So they're going to go in there and they're going to reproduce. And because mice are also prone to coming in those like shrubby areas, ticks are going to attach to mice and they're going to go into those climates created by the barberry, and it's going to perpetuate this cycle of promoting ticks. So if you do have barberry, it is in your best interest to, especially if you have like dogs and stuff, and even for yourself if you're concerned with ticks, to try to get rid of it. Try to cut it down every year to prevent the tick population from spreading. And so because it is an ornamental plant as well, one thing you could just do is to not buy it and to not plant it. And instead you could plant an alternative, something that maybe looks similar and has a similar shrubby kind of look to it that you're looking for an aesthetic. So smoke bush, eastern ninebark, spice bush, these are all different kinds of plants you could plant instead of this if you have a Japanese barberry for an aesthetic appeal. Another one that you maybe didn't even know was an invasive species is the butterfly bush. This is, of course, a beautiful plant. It comes in very different colors, like pinks and purples and white. This is native to Asia as well, and it was introduced to North America in the 1900s. So this is a shrubby plant. They get pretty big. They can, they could be anywhere from like 3 to 15 feet tall or so. And they're going to produce these really pretty tubular flowers from May to August. And like I said, they come in lots of different colors. They are definitely a beautiful plant. So if you're very attached to your butterfly bush, if you do have it, I recommend thinking of an alternative. The pollen for this plant is dust-like, so it spreads incredibly easy. So it can spread from the air, from spreading through the wind. Animals that move by it and brush up against it, that pollen can go on to the animals and spread that way. So it very easily spreads, and it's going to take over disturbed areas and riparian zones. So these are areas where maybe there was construction of some sort, or maybe a tree fell down, and the riparian zone is that area right next to a stream or river, the few feet next to that, and so that you'll find them along the banks of streams and rivers. And we don't really want them there because even though these are beautiful plants and they are pollinator plants, so they attract butterflies and bees and stuff, what's damaging about this is that the butterfly bush does not provide any sort of food for butterfly caterpillars. And so basically it's not serving a purpose to our native populations of pollinators. It's kind of just there for aesthetics and spreading and outcompeting other pollinator species. So it's not doing a service to us. So if you're really attached to your butterfly bush, you do have the opportunity to just dig it out. Don't promote its growth anymore. You can also, if you love pollinator plants or you really are a fan of the butterfly bush, you can plant alternatives to the butterfly bush, such as New England aster, butterfly milkweed, purple coneflower. There's lots and lots of native New Jersey plants that do bring about pollinators and that do provide food for the caterpillars. So if you're really interested in plants that are alternative to ornamentals, jerseyyards.org is really excellent. This is the Jersey Friendly Yards website, and you can go on there. You can even like do like this interactive activity to kind of like design your backyard and to pick native species and how that would look and stuff. You can also do a similar type of thing on audubon.org/native-plants, and you put in your zip code and it's going to tell you what native plants are in your area. So even if it's not butterfly bush, if it's another type of invasive species, you want to stay on top of not purposely planting them. You want to get out of the habit of just planting something that is pretty and think about, is it pretty but also native? And that's going to promote a better, healthier watershed and environment, as it's going to not only give native plants in New Jersey a chance to thrive, but they can also outcompete native species, can outcompete other invasive species, especially if you're already applying a management strategy, such as mugwort or something where you're cutting that down. If you go in and you aggressively start planting native species, there's a chance that you can overpower it and outcompete it. And this is like, just, I read something about this in case you really, really love your butterfly bush, but you still want to be a little bit responsible with it. You can buy a sterile version of this plant instead, so it's not producing pollen that will give rise to anything. You could also remove flowers before they drop their seeds, put them in a bag and just not allow that pollen to get out. So with that being said, these have all been plants, but the next one we're talking about is an insect, and maybe you've heard of the spotted lanternfly. And so if you haven't yet heard of these, this is really quite an interesting species that came into New Jersey. So they're native to China, India, and Vietnam, and they were first reported back in 2014 in Berks County, Pennsylvania. And since then, they've spread to many, many other states, including New Jersey and like Connecticut and stuff. And even though I think they're kind of cute, they got these like big bug eyes and these pretty wings. They just aggressively will feed on the sap of trees, and they're not very picky when it comes to their snacks. They'll just go on to, what is this, over 70 different tree species, and they'll suck out the sap. And the problem with that is that sap is food for the tree. That tree needs that sap in order to keep itself alive. So when a tree gets infested with these spotted lanternflies, it's going to drain that tree of its resources, and it's going to almost always cause that tree to die. So if you have a tree that's infested, you want to do your best to get rid of these spotted lanternflies. And they lay, the females will lay these egg masses on the bark of the tree and the other surfaces. And those egg masses are going to contain about 30 to 50 different eggs. And a female can do this 1 to 2 times per season. The nymphs, these are nymphs, these smaller ones, they're going to hatch in May. And so they lay their eggs in like the fall kind of time and winter. So the best time to actually manage this species is in the winter time, where you can go see where those egg masses are and you can kill them. And you can kill them directly. The egg masses are pretty, they're pretty obvious when you go look at a tree. They're like a light gray mass, and a lot of the times they're cracked, or you'll see like divots where those eggs are, and they're masses on the tree. They're not always huge, but you know, they could be like a clump like this or so. So just so you're familiar with what they look like at every stage. So this is an egg mass. It's like that light gray color, and it's cracked and stuff. And that's going to be on the trees for the most part. Then after those eggs hatch, you'll have the early nymph, which is black and it has these white spots. And then as it gets older, that late nymph, it's going to develop this red color. And then eventually it will become the adult. And the adult has these big spotted wings. And when they spread them, you'll see these red spots as well. So they don't look like anything that is from around here, and they are quite beautiful, like especially their wings and stuff, but they're really, really terrible. They cause a lot of problems. And so they, like I said, they're not very picky. about their food source, but you'll see they really love cultivated roses, grapes, and their all-time favorite snack is the tree of heaven. And the tree of heaven is also a invasive species in New Jersey. This is a type of tree, and the tree of heaven comes from Asia as well. So this is like from its homeland. It's like, this is my favorite snack. So happy it's here, and it's here all the time. And they're not very picky with other trees. They'll snack on anything like a maple, a willow, sumac, river birch, black walnut. And so you can see them on different trees and in more popular times, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to see them. So if you want to manage your spotted lanternflies, one way is to, if you have tree of heaven in your yard, to get rid of it, you can, much like with a lot of other invasive species, you can do a targeted herbicide response where you can maybe cut down the tree and then directly paint on an herbicide. There's lots of different plans for managing these kinds of species and such. But if you do see a spotted lanternfly, it is very important that you report it. So you can see every area of New Jersey that is very close to Pennsylvania, except for Sussex County, has had an infestation of these bugs. So if you do see the spotted lanternfly or an egg mass in Sussex County, especially, you want to take a picture of it and you want to submit it to Report Spotted Lanternfly New Jersey at ag.nj.gov, or you can call the Spotted Lanternfly hotline. So I don't know if anybody's been to Stokes State Park anytime recently, but they have signs all over Stokes about the spotted lanternfly because we're on the watch for it. We don't want this species to spread all over the different counties because it's already put a lot of pressure on our tree species, and we don't want it to continue doing that. If you want to do a little experiment, you can try to go to a different county that does have an infestation, see what it looks like. And you can go out for fun, maybe like, I don't know, like a Saturday afternoon, you're like, oh, I want to go out and kill spotted lanternflies. Here's how you can do it. So you can go out with a straight edge of some sort, so like a credit card or like an old, like flat plastic surface, and you can take that card, and if you see an egg mass, you can literally just take that and scrape the eggs. You want to do it in a way that you pop all of those eggs. And then after popping the eggs, it's very important that you scrape the egg mass either into a container or a plastic bag that has either rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer in it. So you scrape those in there, and it's going to ensure that they're definitely dead and they're not going to hatch. You can also do this when it comes to like even adults or nymphs. If you see them in the spring and summertime, you can just go out into the woods or whatever, and you can scoop them up into a container with alcohol or hand sanitizer, and they'll die from that. It's really important that when you're traveling to other parts of New Jersey that have had infestation, so that's basically every county along the western side of New Jersey, except for Sussex, that when you go there, that you keep your windows up when your car is parked, and that you generally want to do just like a quick look around your car and make sure you don't have any of those nymphs or adults on your car when you leave those counties, and then of course bring them back to a county that doesn't have them. You can also create a spotted lanternfly trap on a tree. So you can do this as an experiment, like if you just want to see if your tree, and maybe you're concerned if one of your trees has it, or you just want to just give it a go and see if anything happens, you can create a spotted lanternfly trap. So the main premise for this is that you want to create some sort of barrier that goes around the entire circumference of the tree. And for some reason, spotted lanternflies only walk up. So that it doesn't occur to them to be like, oh, I'm going to turn around. and not try this tree. They're just like, this is the place to be, and I'm going to keep walking up this tree. So if you put a barrier around the entire tree with just a hole in it, they're going to keep walking up. So what a lot of people have done, so something as simple as literally tin foil and some netting, has caught thousands of spotted lanternflies, and all there is a little opening here, and they just continue walking up, and they're going to keep trying to walk up, but they're never going to get out because you've created a trap. And so they'll end up not being able to consume any sap, and they'll end up dying. This one is a little bit different. So this one wraps around the tree, and it has like this wooden stake to kind of pry it open, and then it has this opening that is attached to a plastic bag that is filled with a hand sanitizer. And so again, what happens here is the spotted lanternfly is going to try to walk up the tree, and it's going to hit the barrier, so it's going to go up into the opening, and it's going to keep trying to climb up, and in this kind of trap, it's going to go up and into the plastic bag with hand sanitizer, and it will die. So these are just two examples of that. There's other ways to go about it, and so this is one way to not go about it. So there's such a thing as insect tape, and they come in various different sizes. This one is a very large surface area. This person had it facing outward, which was originally like the plan was that people would use this kind of sticky tape to capture the spotted lanternflies on their infected trees. But what ended up happening was other non-target wildlife, such as birds, were flying into it and getting stuck. And that's obviously not something we want to happen to these birds and other species. So the best way, if you do want to go with a sticky trap kind of way, is to put some sort of barrier around the tree. So this person used like kind of like a stuffing, and you want to have the sticky tape facing inward. So that's going to really limit the potential for anything like a bird getting caught on that sticky tape. And of course, you want to, for the most part, go with a smaller surface area. So here there's like that fluffy stuffing, and then they just took that sticky tape and faced it inwards. And I saw this on YouTube actually, and she ended up catching like hundreds of spotted lanternflies this way. So all of these methods are valid methods if you have an infested tree, or if you just want to see if you have spotted lanternflies, this is a way that you can detect that. And if you want to get lost in like a YouTube black hole, there's about like hundreds of different videos of different ways you can make spotted lanternfly traps. They get really intense. I just picked a couple that were a little more simple and required less materials. So just to give a recap, invasive species are they're organisms that are coming from a place that is elsewhere, right? They're coming into a new environment, and they tend to cause ecological or economic harm. And this is also not to say that all species that are non-native are causing problems. They don't all cause problems, and sometimes they might even have beneficial characteristics. So an example of actually an invasive species being beneficial is in the Galapagos Islands. So those are a group of islands off the coast of Ecuador. They're nestled right on the equator, and it's home to these Galapagos tortoises, and they're really a protected species there. And once people started living on the Galapagos Islands, they started to cultivate crops, and the tortoises were like, I like these crops too. And so the tortoises that were really doing terrible for their population, like their population numbers were very down. They started seeing that the tortoises were eating the cultivated plants. They're non-native, right? But it was giving them a benefit actually. Their nutrition, their overall nutrition was better from eating these cultivated plants. And also those crops were helping support the local businesses there. So just as an example, not all invasive species or non-native plants are inherently bad or cause problems. some of them do. And some of them really get out of hand, as we saw with things like mugwort and phragmites and zebra mussels, right? For the most part, these species are traveling due to our human activities. This can be us traveling from one vacation location to another spot back home, and we're not maybe cleaning our shoes, or I mean, I've even heard of people wanting to mail seeds across the countries and stuff. It's really important that we try our best not to purposely introduce plant species and other species, because they do oftentimes have some sort of ecological disruption associated with them. And they're able to take over these new areas because they have those performance related traits that give them the upper hand. Phenotypic plasticity, that characteristic where they come into a new environment and they're able to kind of express traits in a way that makes them more suited for that environment than maybe even a native plant or organism. And there might be no source of biological control. I didn't give any examples here of a climate change scenario, but something we might start seeing in New Jersey as an example is our tree species are likely going to start moving more northward. So trees that you would find more commonly in southern New Jersey will likely become more common in northern New Jersey in the upcoming decades. And so some of the common invasive species you might actually find in New Jersey are things like mugwort, Japanese barberry, butterfly bush, and the spotted lanternfly. And these things might have biological consequences, such as outcompeting our native plants, decreasing biodiversity. They might change the food web dynamics. They might cost a lot of money to manage. So for example, public parks will a lot of the times take it upon themselves to go out and manage an invasive species, and that can cost thousands and thousands of dollars just to try to amend that situation. And important to consider here always is that there's no set in stone management for anything, because different management practices are not only going to depend on the species, it's going to depend on how bad that population has gotten out of control, and what your local environment is, and of course how close in proximity you are to water resources. So you just want to be responsible with any sort of management practice you take on, especially if it's like involves pesticides of some sort. You want to be really responsible in your approach. So for anybody that is interested in more detailed instructions on how to handle invasive species, I very strongly suggest the FOVOS website. So you can even just Google this FOVOS, F-O-H-V-O-S, FOVOS, and their website is an excellent resource for invasive species in New Jersey and how to manage them. If you're super interested in this, they also offer an invasive species identification and eradication training. As well, if you have a lot of other questions, more detailed questions, I'm no expert in this. So if you have really detailed questions, you might want to reach out to the Cooperative Extension of Sussex County, which is run by Rutgers University. You can reach them at sussex.njaes.rutgers.edu. And if you're interested in alternatives to herbicides, particularly glyphosate herbicides, which are pretty common actually, here is a resource for that. And also there's at your disposal the Rutgers Master Gardeners, and a lot of municipalities also have their own Master Gardeners. So for Rutgers, their phone number is 973-948-3040. They're open Monday through Friday, and you can call them between the hours of 8:30 and 4:30 p.m. So if I'm just going to leave this slide up for a minute in case anybody needs to take a look at that. But with that being said, does anybody have questions?
Yes, I have a question. Can you hear me?